Welcome to the State of the Nation. I'm your host, Mike Sham. As we know, South Africa has entered the era of coalition partners, coalition governments, and that's going to be with us for a while. We are going to have coalitions for many years to come, and a precursor to the coalition that's been established with the ANC and other parties. We did have the multi-party charter, which was between some of the parties that weren't aligned to the ANC, largely the DA, Action SA, IFP, etc. And the man that ran the multi-party charter and chaired that whole process is with us today, Professor William Gumede. William, welcome. It's great to have you back.
No, thank you for having me. I mean, it's always exciting to talk to you. Looking forward to this conversation.
So we now just passed the magical 100-day mark. Now it's great for people like us because it gives us a chance to find everybody. And so come speak to us for about 100 days of the Government of National Unity. But we are past a psychological political milestone, and that's 100 days where, the roots of the 100-day was Franklin Roosevelt, right?
Yeah. Totally.
Who came in with some dramatic policies to end the Depression and said to everybody, don't judge me after 100 days. And that's just kind of stuck, and it's stuck everywhere. But it is, 3 months, just over, gives people a good opportunity to see whether it's going in the right direction. What is your view on the direction or the achievements of the Government of National Unity? How do you feel about it?
I think we're in a very, very good space as a country. There are very big opponents of the Government of National Unity, opponents within the ANC and outside the ANC. I think this is the best situation the country could have been in. I mean, if it was an ANC over 50% running the country as a dominant party, it would have been a total disaster. I mean, we would have been now a sense of hopelessness. We would have had skills exits, investment exits, and we would just, the country would just not be psychologically in a very good space. I mean, our country clearly, the world's most diverse society, cannot be governed by one dominant party or one dominant group or one dominant color. It has failed in the past, and I think it's a very important psychological and political fact that all South Africans must accept. I mean, there's just too many people still who think, well, actually, only if our group or our party dominates government and politics, we'll change the country and so on. No, that's impossible. It will cause chaos and disaster. So coalition government for South Africa is really the most appropriate model in diverse societies, not only in South Africa, but it has proven the last 100 years elsewhere, both in developed countries and in developing countries, and even in Africa. In Africa has been the most successful model for over 180 years. I mean, 180 years, I have to repeat that. All of the other models, liberation movement governments, military rule, personal rule, all failed, but coalition governments worked. So I think, the 100 days, we're over a psychological barrier. And we've already seen, some early green shoots. I mean, what is the early green shoots? It's a sense of hope. Now, a sense of hope is very important in a country. And people may not realize how important it is. If people are not hopeful in a country, one can't get a growth. People will never invest in a country. Outsiders will also not invest, and people will be always ready to leave or ready, to make short-term decisions rather than long-term decisions. You need a sense of hope. And I think that is very, very important. It wasn't there before the GNU. I mean, just look back even a month before the May elections, like April, March. I mean, there was a sense of hopelessness in the country. So that's very important. Secondly, we've already seen, I mean, if you look at the last 2 months, we've already seen more money coming into South Africa than the whole of 2023. And some critical decisions from corporations who was on the verge of leaving, or at least made announcements that they're leaving ahead of the elections, are now turning back, making U-turns and say, well, actually, looks hopeful. We are, we're going to put our money here at home. We're going to make the investment. We're going to try to create the jobs. And then, just the sense of, for the first time, the sense of cooperation, of the sense of working together. Now, that is also important. Again, it's undervalued in South Africa at a simple level. There are some people who think a government goes into power and then will issue instruction, decrees, and they will automatically be delivery. Now, delivery doesn't work like that. Delivery it works in an integrated system. So you have to get all stakeholders to help you. You want to deliver, you want to create jobs. You need government just as one of the pillars. Then you need business, you need civil society, you need ordinary citizens, and you need foreign investors, and they all need to go in tandem to make delivery or to create the jobs and to get the growth. So I think for the first time we're in that space in a long time where there is a potential alignment of an ecosystem.
And one of the things that all of the people that love the private sector because you got a choice of 50 different hamburgers within 1 kilometer of each other, and you'll choose the one that makes the best hamburger, and that's usually born out of competition. And in a way, we've got a whole lot of political competition now that we didn't used to have. When one party had a majority, we know because we've lived under the ANC rule for 30 years. There was perhaps a disincentive to be better than the other cabinet ministers. Now it may start looking a little differently. We understand that some of the ministers that came out of the ranks of the multi-party charter have been quite approachable, vocal, and got on with the work. And South Africans are a bit stunned that cabinet ministers can be this effective. And, we had a situation where some people within the ANC were complaining about being outshone by those ministers. But now we're starting to see certain ANC cabinet ministers doing a job, and people assessing them not just as one collective, but saying the Minister of Electricity is doing a good job, the Minister of Public Enterprise, not public...
Public Works.
Not just Public Works, but the ANC member of Trade and Industry,
yes, yeah.
Which obviously has always been, the most important portfolio in South Africa that was abused the most by the ANC. But now Parks Tau. Interesting how all these guys were failed mayors, but now they're quite good cabinet ministers. But he seems to be doing quite a good job. We're starting to see it emerge.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, we've got internal competition in cabinet for the first time. The beauty of democracy, which unfortunately as a country we haven't seen up to now, and many other developing democracies don't see, because the beauty of democracy is that people vote for the party, and the party comes to power, and their party is forced to perform, because if the party doesn't perform, people won't vote for the party, right? Now, the problem then is if now that is undermined when people vote for the particular party, not based on the present, and not based on competency, and not based on performance. So if they're based on other things, what are the other things? The past, trauma, color, party ladies from my village, they talk like me, and so on. So once those type of non-democratic issues come into play, a country doesn't get the magic of democracy. Yeah. The country doesn't get the accountability. So the best situation for us would have been, we had the ANC for 30 years as a governing party, ANC drops below 40%, and it's below 40% after the audited, the IC's audited results, sort of 39% plus. In any other situation, the opposition parties would have been able to put a government together. In our situation, it was very difficult because, members of the multi-party charter, DA, IFP, XNS, and so on, could not put a government together because it would have involved the EFF and MK. And EFF and MK were anti-constitutional parties, and they were not prepared to work, for example, with the DA. Or with the IFP. So that was impossible, so it was almost a stalemate. And the ANC had the same same issues, sitting under 40%. They needed some big players to, to form a government. They had the same issues with the EFF, massive, outrageous demands, and the same with the MK, some of the demands.
Get rid of your leader.
Yeah, Ramaphosa must go. EFF, Floyd Shivambu must be finance minister, and so on. I mean, it is totally outrageous. So given that we had that kind of stalemate, it was a decision had to be, the MPC had to make a decision. Or the members of the MPC. This is a stalemate. It is, it changed the game from before. So the expectations was ahead of the election, well, it to drop below 50%, and maybe the opposition parties could form a government. Well, now that wasn't the case. And then some MPC members then decided, well, actually, let's go into opposition, that is Action SA and ACDP. Which was not a wrong approach, it's just a different approach, and so on. And, the other group, DA, IFP, decided, well, actually, given the fact that it's impossible to form an opposition-based government coalition because it would have involved the IFP and MK, maybe the better scenario from a country point of view, from a growth point of view, from rescuing South Africa, from growing South Africa, from making South Africa peaceful and stable, and making South Africa rational. That's really important because I should say, you don't have, we've been struggling with rational governments, people are sensible, and so on, and that was the choice. So given that, we've actually, I think, got the best worlds for the country at the moment.
Explain to me the concept of rational, because I love the idea and I've got my ideas in mind, but explain to me what you mean by a rational government and perhaps where our government was not being rational.
Yeah. I mean, maybe I would say, to simplify it in a common sense, pragmatic, common sense, non-ideological. I mean, a lot of our, up to now, the ANC governments have made policies which are either ideological, either policies which are revenge-based policies, or policies that are wishful thinking, make-believe, fantasy policies that has no basis in reality, will never, ever be implementable. And often these policies have been made on the basis that the government make policy and the government implement policy. Policy implementation doesn't work there.
Yeah.
The government implement in partnership. So successful implementation can only happen in partnership with different stakeholders, not as a standalone. Yes. And that is an important concept in in policy governance and so on. So I think, for me, the exciting part of the GNU coming together, for example, they adopt this as a pillar principle of consensus decision-making. Our consensus decision-making was part of the MPC. That was the MPC's basis of decision-making. So, and it's not only consensus-making, but a whole lot of the structures of the MPC that we put together ahead of the election was now adopted by the GNU. I mean, that for me is the exciting part. And consensus for me is really most important. Let me tell you why consensus. Now, we've been living the last 30 years because the ANC has been a majority. We've been, all decisions in government has been made on majority-based decision making. Even at coalitions at local level, it's been majority-based. The party with the most votes if there's a difference of opinion, different policy differences, their policy carries. Now, in consensus decision making, that's not how you make policies. So the dominant party is equal to all the other parties. And when there's a deadlock, then the decision is measured on essentially three things. The other things, but for me, three important things. One, is that decision or if that policy, is it constitutional, right? Two, is it in the widest interest of the country, not in the widest interest of the specific political party majority or ideology, and so on. These are really, really key considerations because that changes the game. Just the two changes already brings one already to pragmatism. And more inclusive policies. So that for me is very, very important. But let me make just one jump back to your earlier questions, just in terms of internal competition within the GNU. For me, the exciting thing is now is the non-ANC partners, DA, IFP, Patriotic Alliance, Freedom Front Plus, they want to show that they can deliver at a national level. This is their first time in government. I mean, they're excited. You can see the energy The ideas, not only do they want to perform, they have to perform.
Yes.
Because if they don't perform, they're going to go down.
Mm.
And EFF and the MK will be waiting on the other side to take over. Now, the ANC, sadly, because the cabinet members of the ANC, Cyril Ramaphosa, what he did was he tried to balance all of the factions in the ANC and did not appoint ANC cabinet ministers just based on merits. It based on sort of, squaring all of the factions, getting them all happy, which meant that he didn't get there's no competency. Some people have been ANC cabinet ministers forever. I mean, how are you going to revive them now? You're going to energize them.
I think the best way to put it is that Cyril Ramaphosa is a perfect example of somebody who is trying to make an omelette without breaking any eggs, right? Which is absolutely impossible, and that's why the cliche exists. But ultimately, when you make decisions, the only people he's been prepared in the past to disappoint has been his people that are clearly not in his constituency. Right, so NHI, Bellable, he's been happy to break those hearts, but he'll talk out of both sides of his mouth anything that...
Absolutely, yeah. But that is why, for me, consensus decision-making for the first time in our history, and our political history, and our South Africa's modern history, to have consensus decision-making adopted, I mean, it's absolutely groundbreaking because it blocks a party or a leader from only serving their party's interests. And that has been... the disaster of the ANC. Why has the ANC failed in government the last decade? It's been because the party has not governed in the interest of all of South Africa. It is governed in the interest of the ANC, the party, or even a small faction within the ANC, which means decisions are made and policies adopted based on a really small part of South Africa's constituency of the country. And so on. So now, in a consensus decision-making, a party or leader or government does not want to disappoint the country. In majority-based decision-making, the party, the leader, the government does not want to disappoint a small group, a governing group. So there's a big difference in the outcomes, on policy outcomes. If in a consensus one, the whole country is always taken into consideration. And that is why the success, let's just go outside South Africa. I mean, the great successes, Germany after the Second World War, consensus-based decision-making, I mean, massive growth. In Brazil, after, when they adopted, after military rule, when they started the sort of big coalition governments based on consensus making, we saw the Brazilian miracle. The same with Japan. I mean, the preeminent developmental state that we all talk about in South Africa, consensus-based decision making, the country's interests are always bigger than the leader's interests and the party's interests or color or ethnic interests.
Yeah. And what you're saying at the moment, we've got parts of it in place, but not all of it in place, right? Because we can't be blind to the fact that as we sit here now, just after the 100-day mark, that right now we haven't begun the consensus program. We've almost got willful blindness on behalf of the ANC governing as if they're still the majority party. What do you make of that?
I mean, for me, that's going to be, I've got, there are two risks for me, big risks, on which could bring down the GNU. The one is failure by the ANC to make a transition from majority-based decision to consensus-based decision. Because, it's been 30 years of the ANC being in power, they've been in control. I mean, there's a whole ANC, the ANC idea of deployment of cadres into government where they make majority ANC decisions and so on. That transition, because the ANC behave, and parts of the ANC, not only, the ANC proper, but like COSATU, the Communist Party, ANC Youth League, and so on, as if the ANC is in full control. And if the ANC is the dominant party, not understanding that the ANC is, it may have the most votes, but it's not a dominant party anymore. And
it's not a majority party.
No, it isn't.
It's the biggest, it's not the majority.
Yeah, and it needs to begin to negotiate with all sectors of society. And the ANC party policies are not a country's policies anymore. And decision-making, the ANC decision-making cannot happen anymore just for the party. Has to happen for the country and for everyone. I mean, for me, that really is one of the risks. The second risk is whether, I mean, the biggest division in the ANC now is between pro-GNU and against those against the GNU, and whether the ANC can manage that. If they can find some kind of balance between these two groups. And I think there's going to be a head-on battle at the ANC's 2027 elective conference between these two groups. And it will also determine the ANC's succession battle, who will take over from Ramaphosa, because they're essentially, the candidates who are pro-GNU, like Fikile Mbalula, candidate for the ANC presidency. There are those opposed, like Lusufi, the Gauteng Premier, and there is a person like Paul Masatila, the Deputy President, and I see his approach appear to have changed. He's taking a neutral approach of trying to win both groups, the pro and the against groups, and so on. And even Ramaphosa, whether Ramaphosa is going to stay on as country president until
29.
Until 2029, but also depends on what kind of successor takes over ANC president, because you have to remember no ANC leader was the ANC president and then lost the ANC presidency or moved out of the ANC presidency. No one has remained in the country presidency.
Well, we still yet to have a president that completed his second term. Now there is of course another potential pitfall here, but it does come later, and that is, even let's just say this GNU really starts to work, and people really start to see the benefits of everything you speak of, and the ANC does return to majority. Because there are votes that it lost. There's votes in KZN that it lost to MK Party. There's a lot of people sitting on the sidelines, and you could have a situation where the GNU does swimmingly, and the DA goes from 22 to 25%, but the ANC goes from, call it 40% to 51%, and then of course their move the very next second is going to be to torpedo the GNU, isn't it?
No, I don't think the ANC will ever. I think it's the ends of the ANC over 50%. Anyone, I think, who thinks the ANC is going to get a majority again. I mean, in historical terms, no liberation movement is ever, once they drop below 50%, has ever made a recovery. I don't think the ANC is going to be the exception to that rule. I would think success for the ANC in the next election is likely going to be early 30s. If this GNU fails, I think the ANC will get to 20%. If you look comparatively, that's where it is. That is why also it's absolutely important for the ANC to deliver. They have to, this GNU, for the ANC to get, not to drop in the next election below a 30% vote, the GNU must deliver. It's absolutely important for the ANC. I think what will happen is whether the GNU deliver or not, there's very likely going to be a split in the ANC.
Yes.
And the split is going to run alongside those, the pro and against, pro-GNU versus those against the GNU. I think that's what's going to happen. And the GNU, I think, will realign South Africa's politics.
Yes.
And cause another split, which actually would, I think, decisively realign the country's politics. And I actually think that the GNU actually has the potential of out of the GNU could become a long-term coalition of South Africa's politics. So the partners, the parties now in the GNU may actually become the long-term governing coalition of South Africa, almost like in Germany. If you think of Germany, there's been long-term coalitions since the Second World War. I mean, we've seen it in other Scandinavian countries. It has been the same since Japan. We've seen this in Mauritius here, in Africa, and so on. So I think the potential of the GNU, I mean, I think it's a moment in our history. It's an extraordinary moment in our history. It's a break. I mean, previously when we spoke, I talked about the liberation era ending. The liberation era has ended now. And the GNU may actually take us into a totally new direction that we don't even know. And I think it may be the end of the ANC as we know the ANC. We'll have another split, and the GNU partners and the sort of pro-GNU people in the ANC will then could then form, I think, a permanent governing coalition.
Prof, let's have a quick look. We've spoken about some of the people that aren't crazy about the GNU within those parties, and nowhere has it been more visible than in Gauteng, where quite clearly Panyaza Lesufi has, he said it. He's gone on media to say he doesn't want it, and then of course he announced his candidacy in that most ANC way by saying, "Oh, I'm not ready." That's, by the way, ladies and gentlemen, that is the signal that you want nothing more, right? If you haven't seen that 20 times, we heard Jacob Zuma for 10 years say, I don't want to be president. Now, luckily, all he ever says is he wants to be president. But, let's talk about the Gauteng situation and some of that spirit of the GNU factoring down, because, at the end of the day, all politics is local, right? Mm-hmm. Those fancy guys with the blue lights, they create big policies, and you got a 5-year return. Maybe it works, maybe it doesn't. Yeah. But that pothole you drove through this morning is going to probably determine your vote more than the best economic policy. Yeah. Right? What do you make of what's going on in Gauteng, where there seems to be a willful defiance of the GNU?
I mean, clearly, the Gauteng ANC with Lesufi at his head has decided they're going to be, it's become the basis of the anti-GNU forces and faction inside the ANC. Yeah. And it also appears that Lesufi is going to use the anti-GNU wave within the ANC, to enter the presidency, to almost as a wave to get into the presidency. Is what you were saying. Typically, ANC leaders announce the candidacy for the ANC presidency when they say, "I'm not interested, I'm not ready." Yeah. Did you know this is it? This is it. This is actually, this is the first time.
Just don't check in the warehouse because I've got banners that have already been printed.
Banners already printed. And people already deployed across the country. I'm not ready. I'm not ready. But that is, a lot of people have asked the question, now, why did Ramaphosa move against him? To say, well, actually, they potentially could destabilize the GNU. My sense is most probably that Ramaphosa is going to try to give them kind of rope to hang himself on, because in Gauteng, they have to put a budget together pretty soon, the provincial budgets. And already the finance MEC a couple of weeks ago said, look, province may be bankrupt. Now, to put a budget together, they need to get the other parties outside the provincial coalition. And that may be opportunity if they can't put a provincial budget together, or if there's a bankruptcy.
Or a corruption scandal.
Ramaphosa can, and the ANC's national NEC can step in and say, well, actually, we disband the provincial cabinet. That is a scenario which is still open.
And let's not forget that the current Gauteng government presided over the biggest loss for the ANC in any province in the last election. They lost 15% of their vote, and they lost 1/3 of their vote. And they're behaving like they won. So it's a very curious situation. But it does look like, it looks a lot like, if one looks at the Gauteng situation and at Solly Mapaila and his Communist Party, it reminds me a lot of the rumble in the jungle, right? What was it? Muhammad Ali against George Foreman. Yeah, exactly. George Foreman was this massive power hitter, puncher, fearsome man. And Muhammad Ali let him punch himself to a standstill for 7 rounds. And he sat there and took it in the 8th round. The guy could barely stand. Right? It's early days. You can take those blows now. And what are you going to do in a year's time when the story gets a bit old? And some of those things, the financial things have emerged. We know that the Gauteng government killed 150 of its citizens in Life Esidimeni. We know that the Gauteng government killed 70 people in fires in buildings. Those are the kind of things that can be brought up at any stage. You keep them in the bottom drawer, don't you?
Yeah. I think possibly that Lesufi and Gauteng ANC could have misjudged This whole process, the GNU, let's call it steadiness, or the GNU's foundations, and they may have gotten out of the starting blocks too early, and so on, and they may, a couple of months along the line, they may stumble very badly, and they, unfortunately, ANC's National Executive Committee may disband them. They could have tactically waited, most probably. But I want to come back.
Jacob Zuma better keep a parliamentary seat open for him.
Anyway. Exactly. I want to come back just in terms of, what would success mean for the GNU? I mean, what is success? And what do they need to do? Because it's an important conversation, and we don't hear the conversation often enough. I think the key thing for me is in terms of to stabilize. I've started off to say, get rid of the toxic policies. Policies that's irrational, don't make sense. That's really, really important, because that helps with confidence. And it's, makes our politics inclusive, and so on. The second thing in terms of get this, deal with corruption. I mean, people underestimate the impact of corruption. Let me just tell you, if we reduce corruption in the next 2 years, we reduce it only between 10 and 50%. We get a 3% growth. Do nothing else. Just get.
it's economic policy on its own.
Economic policy on its own is just on the corruption. Secondly, just in terms of getting some of the key departments to function. We're never going to get all the departments to function, government departments to function. it's just too corrupt. Incompetent people are entrenched. So decide what are the key growth and job creation and poverty alleviation departments, and then focus there, and then bring in the the areas where government will not be able to deliver. And I know there are a lot of people who think, well, actually, the state is like a Rolls Royce, you can turn it around, or a Ferrari. Absolutely not. I've just come out of the inquiry. I was part of the inquiry of looking at the professionalization of the state. They're part of the state that is not going to be turned around in the next 5 years. We're all of the political world, right? That's the reality. If anyone says otherwise, they live in cuckoo land. It is not the case. But what we have, and I talked about pragmatism before, South Africa's emerging market, our competitiveness, one of our competitive advantages is actually our business and our civil society. Now, because so far the ANC's really ideological policies, it has rejected to involve business and civil society. Both business and civil society are often attacked. Civil society is often attacked for being supposedly a puppet of foreign interests and all sorts of things, although civil society does so much, produce jobs, deliver public services where the government has failed, and so on, and defend our democracy. So the key thing is to use civil society and business to deliver services. That's going to be absolutely critical where the state cannot. So if the GNU can bring that pragmatism in decision-making, policy-making, so, you ask rationality. It's rational to bring in business if they can deliver where the state cannot deliver. It is rational to bring in the public service, to bring in professional bodies. That's very rational. But up to now, in the sort of toxic way of looking at non-ANC partners, business hasn't been used unless it's when a government department fails so badly, like Eskom or then business or civil society are being brought in. So it's going to be critical. And for me, the other one would be in terms of we have to deliver jobs for a couple of million black youths. It's absolutely going to be important. And we have to be creative and imaginative there. I think, what the GNU should consider is just introduce a 1 year or 2 year conscription, whether it is community service or in the military, and not in an old military style way of how to fight and so on, but civic education with artisan education. So that is what they do in other countries. For example, in Switzerland, where young people get into the military, and the idea would be just get discipline. You get civic education is going to be very important, democratic and constitutional education, because that's absolutely critical in our country. Because there's there's a war in South Africa between those who are opposed to the constitution and the constitutional democratic values, and those that are for, those who are anti-constitutional. And the constitutionalists, we have to win this war. Otherwise, this country will collapse. If we have to get the rule of law acceptable as part of our political culture, and the constitution as part of our political culture. And we have to reject as a country any other non-constitutional, whether it is gangsters taking control of this country, or whether it is traditional leaders with autocratic views or non-constitutional views, or even political parties that are set up as criminal enterprises. It's a war that every civic-minded South African must fight. To keep this country a pro-democratic constitutional democracy.
And Prof, it's not too many people that are watching this must be questioning the Constitution's role. Well, I lived half my life in an unconstitutional country. I lived in the old South Africa, which had a parliamentary system. Yeah. What Parliament said went, so therefore the majority of the ruling party, if they've got a majority, whatever they said worked, and that's went. And that's how you give birth to something like apartheid. Yes. I'm always stunned that people don't make that link, because now we've got the second and the fourth biggest party basically wanting to scrap the Constitution. And I'm saying, in our living memory, it was the lack of a constitution that allowed South Africa. Prof, this was for you. It's a present from me. It was our lack of constitution that allowed the National Party to do anything they wanted to do, to trample on human rights, because they write a law, whatever the law is, it gets passed and it's law in the country. And to those people that are not sure the role of the Constitution, look back, go speak to your parents or your grandparents who ever lived through apartheid, and understand that everything that happened there in apartheid was approved by the Parliament. And there was no constitution and no court you could go back and say, but this is ridiculous and this is against human rights. Nothing. Yeah. And that's the fight that you speak of.
Absolutely.
Right? And people have to really understand the difference in why the Constitution is there and what role it performs. Prof, I'd like to just talk about some of the other members of the GNU, and you through your work at the Multi-Party Charter, you work closely with many of those parties that are now in Parliament. What do you make of their approach towards the GNU, their approach towards politics? I mean, I've been quite critical of the leadership of the DA. I think that some of their parliamentarians, some of their cabinet ministers are doing a decent job, but to not push back on some of the issues that they said they were going to push back on, do you think it's undermining them, or what's your opinion?
For me, the lesson from the MPC, what the MPC brought into government is all of those principles of government and agreements have been adopted by the GNU. Many, not all, many of the key ones. And I mentioned earlier the idea of consensus decision making. So it has influenced very much the GNU. So that is important. I think because, when we started off the 100 days, 100 days is almost like a bit of a honeymoon.
Yeah.
It's a honeymoon. So the real fight is kind of still to come in the GNU. But a honeymoon is important to at least to agree on some of the important issues.
Yes.
And so on. And it's going to be now important, post is, or rather, let me use another of explanation in a different way. Now, normally when one gets together in a partnership, whether it's an intimate partnership or business partnership or political partnership, the first part is very, very exciting. You're getting to know your partners, your partner, and so on. And then there's sort of a bit of a honeymoon phase, and all very, very nice. And then the next very important phase is almost a bit of a power struggle phase. And you have to overcome that power struggle. You have to get the agreement. So power struggle phase would be where the values. This party has this value, party then different value from another party. And to reconcile what was going to be the base value, which value is going to be important. And we're going to be in that phase now. So I think many of the things that say were differences or policy differences were not resolved in the first 100 days, but will be, I have to deal with it post now in this power struggle a period. So we're going to expect to see quite a lot of spats
Yeah.
potentially in public. But that is a power struggle phase that they have to get through, and that is why they had to. Why it was important to build strong foundation during this first 100 days of honeymoon, to agree on some of the key principles, because some of the contentious policies will still have to be dealt with, and agreements will still need to be reached during the coming period.
So you'd imagine that some of those issues are not dead yet. Things like NHI, Bella Bill, those kind of issues that are going will still be fought about.
Now that's the hot potatoes, but I mean these are hot potato things. It's not going to go away. I mean what the ANC should have done and still can do is because the GNU, there were policies that the ANC had which was controversial or opposed not only by opposition parties but even civil society organizations, whether it's the NHI or the Bella Bill and so on. So coming into the GNU, what they should have done is to say, well, the policies because those were party policies which were turned into government policies because the ANC had a majority, but others opposed that. To say, well, now we're going into a GNU with partners who oppose those policies. Let's suspend those policies. Let's put it aside and let's reopen negotiations with all of those sort of policies. And that is what consensus means. Yeah. So they didn't do that, although they did. I mean, Ramaphosa did say with the Bella Bill that this was going to happen, and so on. The NHI that is also what should be happening.
Yeah. Or they can do that old ANC policy of just never implementing their own acts, bills. They do that all the time. But actually, Prof, where there is consensus? There's consensus that you should be using Pace Car Rental because they sponsor the State of the Nation, keep us on air. So if you need to rent a car, go use Pace Car Rental and you can get a discount. So, I'm getting good at this now. But so there's a bit more road to come. But now as we head towards the end, because I love speaking to you so much, and you did this hell of a job, putting together the multi-party charter, which sort of crumbled the day after the election results came out, roughly.
No, let me disagree with you. I mean, not crumble. I mean, okay, let's politely disagree. Let's give an alternative.
You see, it worked. It worked. Look at his response. It's brilliant. Okay, right.
Yeah, see, a decision I made. I mean, it was extraordinary circumstances. We think, ANC dropped below 40%.
Yeah,
I mean, that was unexpected, right? The opposition parties, the MPC, cannot put a government together because this involves the EFF and MK. Had a performance that wasn't expected. I mean, they performed double.
Least of all by MK.
Yeah, least of all by MK. So now, rational, pragmatic individuals or leaders will then sit down and say, this is not what we expected. Do we still stay with, pre-agreement agreements, or is there what to do now? What is the interest of South Africa in that context? Is the interest of South Africa for the members of the MPC to go into opposition with the changed circumstances and then have, let's just say, an ANC, EFF, MK government for 5 years? Where will the country be in 5 years under such a government? Would be the most populous government that in South Africa's modern history that we've ever seen, and so on. What would it be impact on the country? Will we get the growth? Will we get jobs? Will we be able to reduce poverty? Will we get peace and a rule of law under such a government? Okay, that's the one reality. Or what would be, should members of the MPC rather join up with the ANC and form maybe an alternative to try to take the country in a different direction? So those decisions are grown-up decisions. So what grown-up leaders should do, that's and so on. And I think that's the decision they made. Even I changed my mind. I mean, ahead of the elections, I penned a paper to make an argument for a potential for the MPC, if they get to a situation like this, to actually consider partnering with the ANC to prevent a populist government, which would involve the ANC and EFF and MK. Obviously, the independent chair of the negotiation, it was not my role to dictate to them, but to make suggestions and recommendations. Because for me, personally, we have to look at South Africa's interest, the country's interest, rather than political interests. And so, what country do we want in 2029? And if political parties of the MPC could intervene to steer the country in a different direction and be in a national government, I thought that should be a route to go. And the parties like the XNSA and ACDP who left seats, they didn't do anything wrong. It's a different approach. That is still very important for them as opposition, because when we talk about state failure and the government's failure, the government failed because the opposition failed. Also, I mean, we have to criticize the opposition also. So it's going to be very important that XNSA and ACDP, MK also, and EFF become effective opposition parties to hold the GNU accountable. So that's going to be very important. Maybe the last thing on this, when Jacob Zuma, when the GNU was announced, Jacob Zuma said in his first press conference, he said the ANC joined the MPC.
Yeah.
Think about it.
True, yeah. So now, in closing, Prof, you did such a great job. You're such a voice of reason. And I know this question was put to you before, but I want to get your denial on air. Political ambitions for yourself. It seems to me that, this country needs the best of the best in government. Would you ever be lured into government?
I was offered political positions during this process. I mean, I politely declined. I think the most important thing for people like me and others like me in civil society and academia is to be outside the state and outside government and to work on a realignment of our politics. I mean, for me personally, that is what I'm going to continue to work on. How do we realign the politics in a constitutional basis? How do we get recenter our politics towards a democratic constitutional center, not a popular center? That's the first thing. Secondly, how do we get the idea across of a partnership approach of governing, that we all in it together? One group cannot govern the country on its own. One color cannot govern. How do we get that? And for me, the third one is in terms of we're the world's most diverse society. Diversity brings growth. So how do we get that idea across? That it is our diversity that will bring us the jobs. Utilizing diversity that's going to deal with our poverty, going to give us the growth. Not going against our diversity. And I think that is a political project on its own for the present and for the future.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, if anybody needs to be listened to, it's Professor William Gumede, one of the really standout South Africans that we really need to hear from more and more and more. Prof, thank you so much for joining us on the State of the Nation again. I've got a feeling we're going to be seeing a lot of you. To everybody that watched this, I hope that you enjoyed it as much as I did. Support Pace Car Rental, like and subscribe to the State of the Nation. About 77% of our viewers aren't subscribers. If you're one of them, just hit the bell over there. It helps us stay on the air. Thank you so much. Prof, thank you very much. We'll see you again on the State of the Nation. Goodbye.